Welcome again to the Peninsula Chamber of Commerce Trade Diversification Committee Vodcast series. And it turns out, I don't think coincidentally, John Trelevin, that there are yet again 3 Johns on our broadcast.
You can never have too many.
That's right. And it turns out we're very honored, very lucky to have John Price on board with us today from Miami, of all places, and he's wearing clearly a Vancouver Canucks T-shirt, aren't you?
That's right. That's right.
We try, John. We try. Anyway, why don't you tell us, please, what you do, and we are going to probe you and ask you about trade activity across the Americas today.
Sure. Well, in this age of, first of all, John and John, thank you so much for the invitation. John Trelevin is an old friend of myself and prior to me, my father. And I hail from Canada and lived in British Columbia 3 times, including finishing my high school there at Prince of Wales in Vancouver. So I'm thrilled to reconnect with my brethren.
Yes.
I'm based in Miami, and I help run a company called America's Market Intelligence, and we are in the business of helping companies grow their business, protect their business, or measure their business in Latin America. So that means helping companies study the markets in anticipation of their growth, defend themselves by understanding the threats that face their business or their projects, as well as measure their performance, particularly those who are well ensconced in the region.
That is an essential tool for anyone looking to expand their trade beyond the U.S., because that's kind of a lot of what's happening. And so far, we've been looking this way. I'm pointing west and east on our previous vodcast. And this is our first chance at looking down south. And of course, this young president has decided to intervene in some of the politics in South America. And so what is the status of looking to South America for business? Is that an active, busy corridor that we're just not aware of?
It is. I mean, it always has been. You know, Brazil and Mexico are both world-class markets in terms of size, and Mexico, especially in terms of accessibility, having signed free trade agreements with something like 60% of the world's GDP. For Canada and Latin America, trade has not been, I would say, over-indexed. By that, I mean, if Latin America represents somewhere close to 10% of the world's GDP, Latin America has represented far less of that percentage of Canada's total exports, and similarly imports. And partly that is misguided or camouflage numbers. And by that, I mean, if you compare what the Canadian government tells us are the Canadian exports to Mexico versus what the Mexican government tells us are their imports from Canada, they're 2 very different numbers. The Mexican number will be double or triple that of Canada. And the reason is that Canada, of course, sells far more commodities and intermediate goods than it does finished goods outside of Canada. And so a lot of those intermediate goods, or even the commodities, will be sold into the U.S., and there will be further value added to them in one shape or another. They'll be branded, and then they'll be sold as a finished product into Mexico. But when the Mexican customs declarations are broken down, they show the point of origin of not just the entire product, but its many components. And so,
do they? Wow.
Yeah, so maybe 30% of the product originated in Canada.
Yeah.
And so that'll be registered as whatever that value is as a Mexican import from Canada. Meanwhile, the Canadian authorities registered it as 100% export to the United States. And so when we talk about an over-reliance on the U.S., that is true, but the numbers are not as high as we think, because again, we lose visibility of where those products go as they are assembled, packaged, branded,
Yeah.
and resold around the world from the US, which is one of the great logistics hubs of the world. Canada lacks, for instance, a lot of direct logistics links to Latin America. Oftentimes, our manufacturers in Quebec and Ontario must essentially go through Florida to reach much of the Caribbean and Central America because it's far cheaper to truck it down to Florida and put it on daily vessels that leave the ports of Miami and Tampa and Fort Lauderdale versus the once a week or once every 2 week sailings that might go out of Halifax or Quebec City or even Vancouver. So there is a, the numbers can be a little bit misleading. Now, what's interesting, I'm very fortunate to be a member of the Canadian, a member of the board of the Canadian Council of the Americas. And the CCA recently published a very interesting report, which I encourage people to read. You can go to their site, which is ccacanada.com. And right away, you'll find a document called Beyond the Build. And this is a document that was sponsored by ATCO, who underwrote it, who very generously underwrote it, and very astutely sort of stayed out of the way and allowed the editors of the document to run its course. I wrote one of the chapters, which was on natural resources, and there was 4 writers in total. And one of the things that we quickly came to realize was if you look at what Canada most exports, which is commodities and intermediate goods, the synergies with Latin America are limited. They are also exporters of commodities. And so it is quite natural that as Canada's looked to diversify its oil exports, its LNG exports, its potash exports, its grain exports, it's looked to Asia and to Europe.
Yeah.
That makes sense. There's more, they're more compatible markets. However, and this doesn't show up in trade figures, is the export of services. So service jobs in general in Canada are some of the highest paying jobs. And by that, I mean like mining services, geological services, all the engineering and testing services that surround that industry, as well as the finance and legal services. The same goes for oil and gas. Calgary is replete with world-class services companies. And where do those guys sell their services abroad? They sell it where those commodities are being extracted. So Latin America being a leading 40% of the world's mining investment goes into Latin America, something like 15% of the world's oil and gas investment goes into Latin America, and that is trending upwards for obvious reasons. And so there's enormous export opportunities for Canadian service companies, as well as our considerable export of financial services and financial capital into those industries, which we know well. I mean, we're the world's leaders in mining. And in some areas of energy, we're also a world leader. So this is where I see Latin America as the more obvious fit for the export of Canadian services rather than goods.
Yeah. Could I just let me add another dimension to this? The truth is that, as you'll know, John, before we were exporting heavily to Latin America, thanks to London, we were flowing what would be in constant dollars billions of British investment dollars through Canada into Latin America. The power company that supplied Rio and Sao Paulo, the telephone company in Rio and Sao Paulo. I mean, there are public utilities all over Latin America that began their businesses with capital officially from Canada. And what that led to is exactly what you're talking about. There was a time in Brazil when Manenco, Montreal Engineering, got all of the electric energy consulting contracts from the Brazilian authorities. Eventually, they had to go to tender and stuff. But when we arrived in Sao Paulo a very long time ago, the Robert L. Borden power station supplied what was a city of 12 million people. Now that's sort of by the by. However, let's remember that, of course, first there was the FTA, then there was NAFTA, and then there was a free trade agreement with Chile. And we've spent a lot of time on trying to alter the policy network, really, the policy environment between Canada and Latin American countries. And I think to great effect. I don't disagree with anything you said about the bulk of our trade will be commodity and services. But have a very significant footprint. A question I would have is you're dealing both with North American and other companies looking at Latin America, but since the election of the current president, what's the environment among Latin American business leaders? How are they adjusting to what, the new Monroe Doctrine, for example?
Sure. Well, the attitudes in Latin America are towards this sort of hegemonic posturing of the United States is very different than that of Canada for a number of reasons. First of all, with the exception of Mexico and momentarily in Panama and momentarily in Colombia, the U.S. has not been as sort of broadly insulting of its partners in Latin America the way Canadians have felt insulted by the treatment between Washington and Ottawa.
Elbows up here.
Yeah. The other thing is, and we all know this as Canadians, is that we're generally a beloved brand around the world. So everywhere you go when you travel as a Canadian, you'll find open arms and open doors, and that's a legacy of a century of good citizenship, good Samaritanism, good middle power politics by Canadian, an overinvestment by Canada in its foreign affairs. We spend more money promoting trade on a per capita basis than any country in the world by far. Number two is Germany, and we're something like 30% higher than them. So we are, well liked around the world. So to suddenly be, insulted and berated in a public forum the way that happened, we're just not used to that. And so, in many ways, it was both surprising and insulting. Mexicans are used to a sort of an unequal relationship with the United States in its many forms, and some of them insulting and belittling, but they're used to it. And they have, I would say, thicker skins when it comes to resisting that. And as a result, the politicians feel less pressure from their own people to, stand up to the Americans. They're also in and this is Mexico very specifically, Mexico is in a far less advantageous position than Canada to negotiate with any degree of power with the Americans. Think of it this way. Canada, most of its exports to the US, I think 70%, are commodities that are fungible products that can be sold to anywhere in the world. Now, obviously, if you have to underwrite the cost of shipping it halfway around the world to China, you're not going to make as much money as trucking it, to Chicago. But nonetheless, you can find an alternative market. For Mexico, most Mexican exports today are either are mostly finished goods that are owned or they are produced through maquila on behalf of a specific company, be it an American company or a German company or a Japanese company or a Korean company or what have you. And there's only one customer for that product. And oftentimes, even if it's not an American company that is the ultimate customer, they are selling to the US because from the US, they're either going to be sold to Americans or re-exported from there. The whole logistical system built around NAFTA was you assemble in Mexico, you send to the US, and then the product goes to its customer, no matter where else. And if the customer's in Mexico, it still goes to the States and back into Mexico. So the Mexicans have much less negotiating. The Canadians don't need American capital. We are a net exporter of capital, right? I mean, Brookfield, the company that you talked about that became Brookfield, has $60 billion of investment in Latin America. Ontario Pension Teachers has something like $30 billion of investment in Latin America. We export capital. We don't need American capital. Mexico doesn't export capital. Mexico needs American and other sources of capital. So they're in a far different position. So that's why you see a more sort of obsequious negotiating posture between the Mexicans and the Americans. The rest of the region, it really changes. The further you get away from the US, there's a very clear correlation. The more their trade is dependent on China and less it is dependent on the United States. And where you find, mixes are places like Chile and Peru, where there's more reliance on China for commerce, but there's more reliance on the U.S. for investment. And so they are loath to try to have to make a choice, right? I mean, there's very few countries in Latin America who want to make a choice between China and the U.S. And so when Trump was elected and Marco Rubio began touring the region, that was one of the messages that they were espousing was you have to choose. And of course, Panama has become a sort of commercial conflict zone as a result of that. For the most of the rest of the region, they've been able to sort of continue to keep a kind of a quiet relationship with the Chinese, and the Chinese are quite happy to operate that way and have a more vocal pro-American choice. Now, coincidentally, and this is where cause and effect needs to not be mixed up, because a lot of people will look at the politics in Latin America, which has been shifting to the right, and say, well, that's the Donald Trump effect. No, my friends, it is not. That is, you have to go back to COVID. So first of all, I believe what Tip O'Neill said, which was all politics is local. However, there are moments, there are events that hit the region simultaneously. The debt crisis of the 80s hit the region at the same time. COVID hit the region at the same time. And Latin America was in a terrible position to fight COVID. It's the most the most urbanized population in the world. Venezuela is the most urbanized country in the world. In many cases, you have 3 generations living under one roof. You have a very underfunded medical system, especially the ICU capacity in the countries where it was devastatingly low. So there was no choice but to do quarantines. And if you thought quarantines were tough in Toronto or in other parts of Canada, people were putting out flags to get food delivered to them because they weren't even allowed to go shopping in Bogota and Lima and Chile. And so what you had was you have a region where 60 to 70% of the population works informally. So imagine you've got a government that has no choice but to do strict quarantines. They have no metrics. They have no way of measuring how intense the infection levels are. So they're following a playbook, which is absolute quarantine. 70% of your people, when you tell them they can't leave their house, their income goes from 100 to 0. Meanwhile, you, the technocrat in your government, continues to work from the comfort of your home using Zoom. Well, you can imagine the rancor this generated,
Exactly.
the hatred that this generated. And so you had a class warfare politics, 30 years of gradual progress at diminishing some of the worst distributions of income in the world. Poco a poco, year after year, it was getting a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. In 8 months of quarantine, we lost 15 years of progress on that front. That was a recipe. So what became a health crisis became an economic crisis, which became a political crisis. And in 2023, we had 7 leftist populists leading the 7 largest economies in Latin America. And amazingly, the damage they did, with the exception of Mexico, and that AMLO did a lot of damage, but in most of the rest of the countries, the damage was limited because the untold story in Latin America over the last 30 years has been the gradual strengthening of institutions that have hemmed in the populist instincts of these leaders. And so now, by limiting the damage, Colombia is a great example. This Petro wanted to bring forth 32 major reforms. He got 1 diluted reform through. And so by hemming these guys down and showing that we basically lost the last 3 years of economic progress in Latin America because of this populist political thinking. But what we're seeing now is voters saying, no, we want something more pragmatic. We want something less populist. We want something more centrist. Sometimes it's a little more right-wing like a Milei, but we are rejecting this sort of class warfare leftist rhetoric that is proven it's not working. And so that's what's tilting the politics to the right, not Donald Trump. In fact, Donald Trump may end up helping Lula win in Brazil by endorsing the Bolsonaros, who is a very divisive leader, much like Trump is within the Republican Party. And Lula might end up winning. Whereas if you didn't have a Trump in power, Lula would be out.
John,
Okay,
if I could just turn, that's fascinating. That is, we have interviewed my friend and former colleague David Winfield, who was ambassador in
sure.
Mexico, who lives in Mexico. We've had an interview with him. We're going to go back, and I'd love to have the two of you on. It would be wonderful. And
Well,
in
David's like a
Victoria,
godfather to me because he got me started in Mexico. He made a couple introductions that
oh,
got me
oh,
started.
get out,
okay, we're
John.
going to
Make
do
that
that.
happen.
We're
Yeah,
absolutely going to do that.
John,
And,
John.
yeah. And then Juan Navarro is a Mexican-Canadian
Sure,
economist who's done
sure.
research. Do you know him?
I know of him. Sure, I know
Okay,
of
well,
him.
guess what? He's extremely good. He's worked on APEC research and all
Sure,
this stuff.
sure.
So I think we're going to have a nice maybe four-way conversation there. Oh, and also Pedro Marquez, who has for years been the dean of commerce at Royal Roads University, is a Mexican economist who spoke at
Sure,
a
sure.
conference actually
Yeah.
that we both attended last Friday. There's tremendous interest and resources available. Um, I would like to think that, particularly with your description of, let's say, a more centrist governments breaking out in Latin America, that the economies will return to something like normal. Andrei Selzenko was one of the Canadian trade negotiators that they have the FTA. I mean, very distinguished working in global affairs. And he wrote an article in the Globe and Mail some months ago talking about with the American economic developments, the world is going to form a donut around the United States, a trade donut. And I think he has a point. And I'll give you one example, which is amazing. A friend of mine is in the yacht management business, and we live in Victoria. There's a huge recreational boating industry here, like
Sure.
very significant, more than Japan, for example.
Hmm.
He has a client, an American, who purchased a boat somewhere, I don't know where, but he brought the boat to Victoria to be custom fitted and whatnot, brought it to Canada. And although he lives in the United States, when that project is finished, the boat is where he wants it to be, the boat will be moved to Mexico so that he doesn't have to pay US tariffs.
Right, right.
And that's a microcosm, but well, we know. I mean, the world will gradually adjust. And I have a strong sense that by the time we're fully adjusted, the cause of our adjustment will begin to dissipate. The need to adjust will begin to dissipate.
Well, it's difficult to forecast a week in today's environment, let alone 4 years. But I do believe and I don't think this was the purpose of our call, so I don't want to digress too much. But I do believe we've reached peak Trump in the United States, and by that I mean his ability to influence the political outcomes in the United States, his ability to reshape the business environment, I think, is coming up against institutional pushback, much like populists elsewhere. We just saw Orban drop in Hungary. We'll see Petro and his likes lose in Colombia, and the reason his damage was less than it could have been is precisely because of institutions. So we see a political leader who was an asset to his party in the last election has now become a liability to his party for those fighting in contested seats in the midterm elections. And so you're already seeing some distancing by Republicans. Most importantly, and thankfully, the most important institution in the United States, or the two most important institutions in the United States, in my mind, which are the courts and the Fed, or the central bank, have held up to his efforts to undermine them. Not entirely, that he's definitely done some damage there, but there's been pushback. There's been pushback on tariffs. There's been pushback on the legal case against Jeremy Powell, which was thrown out by the courts. So I, things seem rather catastrophic at this point in time, and there's lots of sort of conspirational thought that goes into what might happen and how Trump might interfere and what does he do? What are all these things doing and leading to in terms of manipulating elections? I don't believe that you can manipulate elections in the US very easily because they're so decentralized, not even at the state level, at the county level. So I do believe that the US will withstand Trump and that what follows Trump hopefully will be something more centrist because I don't think flipping to the other extreme is helpful either. We need to get away from populism. Um, it became very popular to denigrate globalism and things like that. But globalism and the system of rules that we built post-World War that Canada and other middle powers benefited from and also were the most important pillars of um, is a system that has limited warfare and has allowed wealth to grow far beyond the small cluster of countries where it was concentrated 70 years ago. And I think cooler heads like our own prime minister will prevail and show that, okay, let's learn from the mistakes we made. Let's make sure we don't necessarily double down on the exact formula we had before, but let's go back to something more reasonable, more rules-based, more technocratic.
Okay, but
So
in this
John,
in
so
the
John,
dynamic era in which we're living, how often do you have to update market research you're doing for your customers? You mentioned earlier, in a week, everything can change.
Well,
How
part
do
of
you?
what I do beyond the studies that we do, which, is really driven by the particular needs of a client and an industry, I do a lot of public speaking and a lot of it is, forecasting. So I'll be hired by a company that's doing its annual planning or by a company that's doing, say, a client-facing conference, and they'll bring me in to provide a forecast to the region. And I heard a great quote the other day that is not very self-serving, but it said, the more volatile the economic and political situation is, the more we rely on forecasters, and the more useless forecasters are. So there's a
so
lot of
so
truth to that. But the reality is that it's definitely the speaking side of my business has definitely flourished under Donald Trump, and I should thank him for that.
so John, we're now at the likely limit of our digital audience who don't have a lot of patience for this kind of amazing, informative information. However, I'll leave you with, let's say this will be our last question.
Sure.
So back to sort of where we started. All right. So if a company's watching this in BC, of which is 98% small business, they're just folks don't not have a capacity to really understand other markets very well. So we're trying to teach them and take advantage of trade commissioner services, etc. But what so many small business owners are seeing in their quest to diversify trade are some of the highlighted issues on TV. So there literally a war in Puerto Vallarta. There cartel activity, sort of stimulating a concern around stability. Uh, Trump just walks in and takes over Venezuela. We hear weeks later he's in Ecuador. Then some of his buddies from Argentina show up at Mar-a-Lago. Can you dispel those myths? And if you're talking now to a small business who's wondering
Sure.
whether to go left or right, or should I really examine the other Americas, can you indicate to what degree is that myth? Yeah.
Sure. No, I appreciate that. And let me just preface what I say by pointing people to our website, which is americasmi.com. And if you do a search there for an article called Market 10 Market Entry Blunders, I think you'll find it quite informative. So let me just, and no disrespect to the trade commissioners world, of which my father was a proud
Integral
participant,
part. Mhm.
and the efforts of Ottawa to promote trade. But the reality is this: we live next door to the greatest market in the world, the United States, and um, if that market is less accessible today, or there's a fear that you might get shut out by a change of whim in Washington, and you're looking to emerging markets, I would say any market, but particularly emerging markets, there's plenty of opportunity in Latin America. But first of all, the cost of entry is significant. And by that, I mean not just the cost of flying down, but it takes time to build relationships because there's differences in legal systems and language and culture. So it's multiple trips. It's a year of trips. It's a year of giving out samples. It's a year of, it takes time to find reliable partners. So first of all, pick one country and one country only. Secondly, you will find it a heck of a lot easier to sell to American and Canadian and British and French and Italian and German companies operating in Mexico than it is to sell to Mexican companies. They pay better, they pay on time, they pay.
Yeah.
That's
right.
And they appreciate, the sort of value-added arguments of your product. So oftentimes the trade promotional branches of government, be it Canadian or wherever, will focus on the local companies because they want to foster trade. But for a small company, the risks are too high.
Yeah,
much better to sell to a Canadian or American company operating in Mexico than sell to a Mexican company, and a lot easier and a lot faster.
Yeah, all I would say, I spent quite a number of 4 years in Japan and 3 years working on Japan, and many Canadian companies worked through the trading companies, which they should have.
Right.
But our constant advice to Canadian companies was, by all means, work through the intermediaries for all the reasons you've suggested. But do your market research so that you understand how it is your product fits into that market, that the company in Germany is going to, be the distributor.
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
And as long as you knew that, well, then you're in a good position to set your margins with the German company or the Boston company.
Right.
Because you got a very good idea of what's going on. So,
no, it still has to be a competitive offering. And it's funny you mentioned Japan, because the Japan and the Koreans are the best in the world. What they will do, what JETRO does, which is their export trade office, is they'll call up a Japanese company operating in Brazil, and they'll get a picture of who their supply chain is. And if their supply chain is not 100% Japanese companies, they'll say, well, I know you're buying, X product from a US company. How do you feel about giving an opportunity to a Japanese company? So the Japanese mastered this going back to the 60s. They understood that the easiest way for small and mid-sized exporters coming out of Japan would be to sell to the big Japanese companies, and for the Koreans, the chaebols that operate around the world. Canada needs to develop that strategy as well.
Yeah, as long as the Canadian company understood how their product was being marketed in Japan.
Sure.
And I can tell you of one major Canadian industry that didn't understand that. So it doesn't lessen the need for market intelligence, which is your business,
right,
by the small company on that market, and then find the best way to get their product in. I agree. I think it's great.
No, and that's not the only market you want to sell to, but it's the first customers you want to knock on the door. And once you build a business and learn the market, now you're actually got some profit being generated in this foreign market. You start hiring local people, then you can start to expand beyond that into higher risk customers.
Absolutely.
John Price, this is extraordinary information. John Trelevin, thank you for introducing me to this gentleman. I really hope that we can get perhaps other speakers on, if John is so inclined. And let's just finish this off by saying that's not a Vancouver Canucks jersey. Obviously, for any of those folks that know, why don't you just tell us what that jersey is, and we'll say goodbye to you.
So I met my German wife in Mexico City, and I used to support Mexico in the World Cup. And when my second son was born, she said, "I think it's high time you started supporting Germany." So I changed my camiseta, and so this is a German World Cup, I think 2018 World Cup practice jersey. That's why it's the unusual color. And I just happened to have come from watching the Bayern München Real Madrid quarterfinal game, very exciting game. So this is why I'm rather casually dressed in this jersey. So I appreciate your
John,
appreciate your open invitation.
It's so much fun to catch up with you, and we
It's
look
been
forward
great.
to doing it again.
Absolutely.
To
Take care,
state the
gentlemen.
obvious, your father was a legend in the Trade Commissioner Service, a legend.
Well, it's nice to hear. Thank
And
Yeah, well,
you
so is his
obviously
son.
have followed in his footsteps.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Well, he was a very skilled person. I like to think I picked up a few things, but yeah, he was a trailblazer for sure.
Well, I could
Absolutely.
listen to you
Yeah.
forever. But we're going to say goodbye today. Gentlemen,
Thank you.
take care.
Thank you both. Take care
Bye
now.
now.